On April 19, 2026, a Russian fuel train suddenly erupted into flames in occupied Zaporizhzhia, turning one stretch of railway into a wall of fire visible for miles. At first glance, it looked like another drone strike in another endless day of war. But within hours, something far more dangerous had already begun unfolding behind the front line. Vehicles stopped moving. Supply schedules started collapsing. Entire sectors quietly lost momentum. This war is no longer decided only by tanks, trenches, or artillery. It is increasingly decided by who can keep moving and who cannot. And right now, Ukraine is trying to turn Russian logistics into the real battlefield. Subscribe to Military Force as we break down how one burning train may reveal the future of modern warfare itself. Because to understand why this single strike mattered so much, we first need to understand how Ukraine is systematically redesigning battlefield attrition around logistics disruption and drone pressure. What happened in Zaporizhzhia on April 19, 2026 was not just another successful drone strike, because the real target was never only the train itself. The real target was the entire flow of Russian military movement behind the front line. Earlier that day, a Russian freight train moving through occupied territory reportedly derailed after reaching a damaged section of railway near one of the most important logistics corridors in the region. Within a very short time, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones detected the immobilized convoy, and what started as surveillance quickly turned into a coordinated strike operation. FPV drone operators did not waste time attacking random cargo cars or empty sections of the train. Instead, they focused directly on the fuel tankers, and that decision tells us a lot about how this war is changing. Fuel has quietly become one of the most valuable resources anywhere along the battlefield. Tanks cannot move without it. Troop transports stop operating without it. Generators inside command posts rely on it every hour of the day, while engineering vehicles, recovery trucks, and logistics convoys all compete for the same supply network. A modern army may look powerful from the outside, but behind every armored assault sits a long chain of fuel deliveries that must arrive on time. Once Ukrainian drones ignited those tankers, huge columns of fire and black smoke began spreading across the rail corridor. The heat became so intense that nearby sections of track were no longer safe to access quickly, while damaged freight cars blocked movement behind the derailment zone. Even units far away from the explosion were likely affected because one interrupted shipment can create delays across an entire operational sector. That is why railways still matter so much in this war. Russia continues to depend heavily on rail transport because trains can move enormous amounts of fuel, ammunition, heavy equipment, and replacement vehicles much faster than road convoys alone. This has been part of Russian and Soviet military thinking for generations. Rail systems allow large armies to sustain long offensives over massive distances, especially in regions where roads are limited or weather conditions become difficult. But that dependence also creates vulnerability, because once a railway corridor is damaged, entire supply schedules can begin falling apart in ways that are not immediately visible on a battlefield map. And that invisible pressure may now be one of Ukraine's biggest advantages. Modern wars are increasingly shaped not only by explosions at the front line, but by whether supplies can continue reaching soldiers day after day. A delayed fuel shipment may not make headlines immediately, yet several hours later tanks remain parked in tree lines waiting for orders that never come. Fuel trucks fail to arrive at forward positions. Units preparing for movement are suddenly told to hold their location longer than expected. Repair teams sit idle because replacement parts are still somewhere far behind the line. The slowdown begins quietly, then spreads outward sector by sector. This is exactly why Ukraine has placed growing emphasis on logistics disruption over the past year. Instead of focusing only on destroying large numbers of armored vehicles, Ukrainian drone units increasingly aim to break operational rhythm itself. Their objective is not always dramatic territorial gains in a single day. In many cases, the goal is to make Russian operations slower, heavier, and less predictable over time. A single destroyed locomotive may affect dozens of downstream units waiting for fuel or equipment. One blocked rail corridor can force rerouting decisions that increase delivery times across hundreds of kilometers. Every delay creates another opportunity for surveillance drones, artillery, or FPV teams to attack again later. What makes this strategy especially dangerous is that it compounds over time. Armies rarely collapse in one sudden moment like they do in movies. Most military systems begin failing gradually. Vehicles move less often. Troops become more exhausted carrying supplies manually. Offensive operations are postponed. Commanders grow more cautious because they are uncertain whether support assets will arrive when needed. Eventually, the battlefield begins slowing down, and once momentum disappears, regaining it becomes extremely difficult under constant drone pressure. And this burning train in Zaporizhia was not an isolated event. It was one visible piece of a much larger system that now operates almost every hour of the day above the battlefield. Ukraine's drone warfare strategy has changed dramatically since the early months of the war, because drones are no longer being used only to spot enemy positions or guide artillery fire. What now exists above large parts of the front line is something much bigger and far more dangerous. A continuous aerial disruption network that operates almost every hour of the day. In 2022, many drone missions were still limited to short reconnaissance flights followed by occasional strikes. Today, Ukrainian UAV units function more like a rotating combat system where surveillance, targeting, attack coordination, and redeployment happen in an almost non-stop cycle. The battlefield no longer pauses when one drone disappears, because another one is usually already moving into position. This constant aerial presence has become one of the defining features of the war. Ukrainian drone teams now operate through overlapping shifts that include reconnaissance pilots, battery replacement crews, strike coordinators, payload preparation teams, and FPV operators waiting for target confirmation. Once a drone identifies movement, the information is quickly passed through digital networks, and attack authorization can happen within minutes or sometimes even seconds. The process has become brutally efficient: detect, confirm, strike, reassess, then strike again if needed. In many sectors, this loop repeats throughout the day and deep into the night, creating pressure that rarely gives Russian forces time to fully recover or reorganize. And that pressure is not always designed to destroy everything immediately. In many cases, the objective is exhaustion. Ukrainian commanders increasingly understand that slowing Russian operations can be just as valuable as eliminating a single armored vehicle. Repeated drone attacks force units to delay movement, change routes, hide equipment, and spend additional manpower protecting logistics lines instead of preparing offensive action. Over time, these interruptions begin stacking on top of one another. Fuel consumption becomes harder to manage. Assault plans are postponed because support vehicles arrive late. Troop rotations slow down, while artillery crews sometimes wait longer for ammunition deliveries. Recovery teams also face growing risks because damaged equipment often sits exposed under aerial surveillance before it can be evacuated. This is why many military analysts now compare drone warfare in Ukraine to historical air interdiction campaigns, although there is one major difference: cost. In previous wars, disrupting enemy logistics deep behind the line usually required expensive aircraft, precision-guided bombs, and full air superiority. Today, relatively cheap FPV drones are performing some of those same missions for a fraction of the price. A small drone carrying a modest explosive charge can threaten fuel trucks, locomotives, radar systems, and even armored vehicles worth millions of dollars. That shift is attracting attention far beyond Eastern Europe because military planners in Washington, Beijing, London, and NATO headquarters are all studying what this means for future conflicts. But the most important effect may not be physical destruction. It may be psychological pressure. Russian soldiers increasingly operate under the assumption that they are being watched from above almost constantly. That changes behavior in ways that are difficult to fully measure with statistics alone. Troops hesitate before crossing open ground. Vehicles remain hidden under tree cover for long periods instead of moving freely. Supply teams often wait until darkness before transporting food, fuel, or ammunition closer to the front line. Even small sounds now create tension, especially the distinct high-pitched noise of FPV drone motors approaching overhead. In many combat videos from the front, soldiers can be seen freezing for several seconds after hearing that sound, because they understand how little reaction time remains once a drone begins diving toward a target. Drone saturation is also reducing the effectiveness of traditional concealment. Thermal imaging systems, infrared optics, and pattern recognition software are making it harder for troops to remain hidden for long periods. A position that once seemed secure during earlier stages of the war may now become vulnerable within minutes after movement is detected. Battlefield transparency is increasing rapidly, and that is changing warfare itself. In the past, armies could often rely on distance, darkness, forests, or rough terrain to reduce observation. Now those concealment windows are shrinking. The side that identifies movement faster and launches, strikes quicker, increasingly controls operational tempo across the battlefield. And that growing Ukrainian pressure campaign is now forcing Russian forces into battlefield adaptations that would have seemed almost unthinkable only a few years ago. Russian forces are now being pushed into battlefield adaptations that would have looked almost unbelievable at the start of the war, because large formations and heavy movement patterns have become extremely dangerous under constant drone surveillance. Earlier in the conflict, armored columns could still move in relatively concentrated formations, especially outside major combat zones. Today, that kind of movement often attracts immediate attention from reconnaissance drones circling high above the battlefield. Once detected, the information spreads quickly through digital targeting networks, and strike drones or artillery units can respond before convoys even reach their destination. This growing danger is forcing Russian troops to abandon many traditional movement methods and replace them with smaller, more fragmented approaches designed mainly to survive aerial observation. One of the clearest changes can be seen in the growing use of small infantry groups instead of large assault formations. Rather than moving dozens of soldiers together, units increasingly split into smaller teams that attempt to cross open terrain separately. The logic is simple. A single squad creates a smaller visual signature and becomes harder to track from the air. But this tactic also creates new problems because smaller groups carry less equipment, have weaker firepower, and struggle to maintain momentum once casualties begin appearing. In many sectors, these teams move cautiously through tree lines, damaged villages, and cratered terrain while constantly trying to avoid aerial detection. The battlefield has become less about rapid maneuver and more about surviving long enough to reach the next position. Motorcycles have also started appearing more frequently near some frontline sectors, and that alone says a great deal about how warfare is changing. Compared to armored vehicles, motorcycles are cheaper, faster, quieter, and easier to hide under trees or inside ruined buildings. Their smaller size makes them harder to identify quickly from long distances, especially during poor weather or low visibility. Some Russian units now use them to transport ammunition, medical supplies, or personnel between forward positions where larger vehicles would immediately attract attention. But speed alone no longer guarantees survival. Once an FPV drone establishes visual lock, even fast-moving targets become vulnerable. Combat footage from several sectors shows motorcycles racing across dirt roads or fields, only for drones to follow closely behind before striking seconds later. And this is where the emotional reality of the war becomes impossible to ignore. Modern battlefield adaptation increasingly looks less like organized maneuver warfare and more like survival improvisation under constant pressure. Russian soldiers are now regularly seen carrying ammunition boxes, fuel containers, food, and water manually across long distances because vehicle movement has become too risky in many areas. Some routes reportedly stretch beyond 10 kilometers, depending on terrain and enemy drone activity. That creates enormous physical strain, especially for troops already exhausted from combat conditions, poor weather, and lack of sleep. A soldier carrying supplies on foot moves slower, delivers less equipment, and becomes more vulnerable during the entire journey. Over time, this reduces resupply capacity and limits how long frontline units can maintain sustained combat operations. At the same time, Ukrainian drone teams are systematically targeting places that soldiers once considered relatively safe. Dugout entrances, trench access points, damaged basements, abandoned houses, and temporary shelters are now under much closer surveillance than earlier in the war. FPV operators often aim directly at entryways or weak structural sections because explosions inside confined spaces can create devastating pressure effects. This has changed battlefield behavior dramatically. Soldiers who once used ruined buildings for cover now hesitate before entering them. Troops avoid roads during daylight whenever possible. Some remain motionless under broken concrete or collapsed roofs for long periods simply to reduce the chance of aerial detection. Drones are not only eliminating personnel anymore, they are slowly removing the idea of safety itself from large parts of the front line. Another growing problem comes from confusion in the sky. In a battlefield crowded with UAVs from both sides, many soldiers struggle to identify whether an approaching drone is friendly or hostile until it is already very close. FPV systems move fast, appear suddenly, and often produce similar sounds regardless of nationality. That hesitation can become deadly. A few seconds spent trying to recognize a drone may be enough time for an operator to complete an attack run. This psychological pressure is becoming just as important as physical destruction because troops now operate knowing danger can appear from above at almost any moment without warning. But while infantry units continue adapting on the ground, the deeper struggle in this war remains focused on the transportation systems that keep entire armies alive. Rail infrastructure has become one of the most valuable targets anywhere in the war, because the Russian military still depends heavily on trains to sustain large-scale operations across enormous distances. This is not something new that appeared during the Ukraine conflict. Russian and Soviet military planning has relied on railway systems for generations because rail transport can move fuel, artillery ammunition, armored vehicles, engineering equipment, and troop reinforcements far more efficiently than road convoys alone. A single freight train can carry cargo that would otherwise require dozens of trucks moving separately across vulnerable highways. That logistical advantage helped Russia support large offensives in the early stages of the war, but it also created a dependency that Ukraine is now trying to exploit more aggressively. Today, Ukrainian drone units and long-range strike teams increasingly focus on railway choke points, bridges, switching stations, locomotive depots, and repair corridors, because disrupting one section of track can affect operations far beyond the immediate target area. And in many cases, the locomotive itself matters even more than the cargo behind it. Once an engine is disabled, attached freight cars carrying fuel, shells, spare parts, or engineering supplies may become stranded for hours or even days, depending on the location and the level of battlefield pressure nearby. Repair teams must then enter dangerous zones already under aerial surveillance, while replacement locomotives are redirected from other sectors to restore movement. The result is not just one delayed shipment. Entire logistics schedules begin shifting behind the front line. This is why operational timing is becoming almost as important as battlefield firepower. A modern military offensive depends on coordination between fuel deliveries, artillery support, troop movement, medical evacuation routes, and reserve deployment. If one section slows down, pressure spreads through the rest of the system very quickly. A delayed train may force ammunition trucks to wait longer before unloading cargo. Armored units preparing for attacks may receive fewer supplies than expected. Recovery vehicles tasked with repairing damaged equipment might arrive too late to prevent further losses. None of this creates dramatic footage immediately, but over time the effects become extremely serious because momentum begins disappearing across multiple sectors at once. And that is one of the most important lessons emerging from this war. Armies often begin weakening quietly long before maps show major territorial changes. A frontline position may still appear stable from above, while behind it fuel deliveries are arriving late, repair systems are overloaded, and commanders are reducing movement to conserve resources. The battlefield does not always collapse in one large moment. Sometimes it simply slows down until offensive capability starts fading piece by piece. Ukraine understands this increasingly well, which is why rail disruption has become a growing priority rather than a secondary objective. There are also strong historical parallels here. During World War II, Allied air forces spent enormous resources bombing rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and transportation networks deep inside occupied Europe because military planners understood that armies without reliable logistics eventually lose operational flexibility. The difference today is cost and accessibility. In the past, these interdiction campaigns required fleets of heavy bombers, advanced aircraft, and large industrial economies supporting them. Now, relatively cheap drones costing a fraction of a missile system can threaten railway assets worth millions of dollars. A small FPV drone striking a locomotive engine may create operational consequences far beyond the size of the weapon itself. That shift is drawing close attention from militaries around the world. NATO planners, Chinese strategists, and defense analysts across the Indo-Pacific are all studying Ukraine carefully because this war is becoming a real-time laboratory for modern attrition warfare. Many armed forces spent decades preparing for precision missile strikes and advanced air campaigns led by expensive aircraft. But Ukraine is showing that low-cost unmanned systems can now perform missions once associated only with major air power nations. This changes how countries may think about supply security, rear area defense, and battlefield movement in future conflicts. The visual evidence from the war already reflects this transformation. Silent locomotives sit abandoned near damaged tracks, while freight cars remain stranded without crews willing to approach under drone observation. Rail junctions wait for repairs as burned sections of infrastructure block movement behind them. Supply routes that once handled steady traffic now require rerouting decisions that increase travel time and fuel consumption. One interruption on a major line can force cargo into smaller transport networks that are slower, less protected, and easier to target later. And as both sides continue flooding the battlefield with UAVs, even movement far behind the front line is becoming increasingly dangerous. The war in Ukraine is creating a battlefield where traditional protection methods are losing effectiveness because constant UAV presence now exposes movement faster than many armies can react. Earlier in the war, camouflage, distance, forests, or damaged urban areas could still provide temporary safety for troops and vehicles. Today, those advantages are shrinking rapidly. Thermal sensors, aerial surveillance, infrared optics, and coordinated strike networks allow drone operators to detect movement that once would have remained hidden. In many frontline sectors, daytime movement has become extremely dangerous, especially for vehicles carrying supplies or reinforcements. Once a drone identifies a target, the time between detection and destruction is often measured in minutes, or sometimes seconds. This growing battlefield transparency is changing how soldiers survive. Heavy armor still matters against artillery fragments and small arms fire, but FPV drones attack differently. Operators often aim for weak points like engine compartments, roof sections, or exposed rear areas where protection is thinner. That means even armored vehicles worth millions of dollars can be disabled by relatively cheap drones carrying small explosive payloads. At the same time, lighter transport such as motorcycles may move faster and create smaller visual signatures, yet they become just as vulnerable once identified from above. Survival increasingly depends less on armor thickness and more on remaining unseen long enough to avoid detection entirely. Because of this, counter-UAV warfare is expanding rapidly across the battlefield. Both sides are now investing heavily in electronic warfare systems, signal jamming equipment, aerial interception drones, and mobile hunting patrols designed specifically to track enemy UAV activity. Ukrainian units have reported multiple days where incoming aerial threats were intercepted one after another before reaching frontline positions. This constant battle above the battlefield has become a war inside the war itself. The sky is no longer just empty space above combat zones. It has become an active operational layer where surveillance, interception, and attack cycles continue almost non-stop. And the human impact of this transformation is becoming impossible to ignore. Soldiers hide quietly beneath damaged buildings while listening for drone motors overhead. Supply vehicles move mostly at night to reduce exposure from aerial surveillance. Troops sometimes remain motionless for long periods, simply to avoid drawing attention from cameras circling above them. In many areas, future soldiers may spend more time trying to avoid machines than fighting visible enemies directly. Which brings us back to the burning train that started this entire chain reaction in the first place. The burning train in Zaporizhzhia was never just about one explosion, because the real target was Russia's ability to keep the war moving forward. First, the rail line was damaged, then the train derailed, then Ukrainian drones ignited the fuel tankers, and after that the pressure spread far beyond the fire itself. Fuel deliveries slowed down, locomotives stopped operating, frontline movement became harder, and supply schedules started slipping across multiple sectors. This is how modern drone warfare now works. Instead of relying on one massive breakthrough, Ukraine is building constant pressure day after day until Russian operations become slower, weaker, and more difficult to sustain. Armies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. More often, they simply lose momentum first. And right now, Ukraine may be showing the world what industrial attrition warfare looks like in the drone age. Subscribe to Military Force for deeper battlefield analysis and real-time coverage of how drones are reshaping modern war.